Hello everyone, Neil here once again. It's been a couple weeks since the last time I posted anything. I want to give you some time to get the color wheel put together and the pigment file. The pigment file is what we're going to be working on today. I promised that at the end of the last video. Before we go any further, let me apologize for the sound. It's raining pretty hard right now, and I'm sure you can hear the sound of the rain hitting the roof. So my apology, but we're going to soldier on through it. So, the pigment file. If you remember where we left off, you made the value scale color wheel. The value scale color wheel had 20 hues, and we went about mixing all the formulas for the strings of each hue. A string is a series of values from light to dark of a particular hue. So we had the value scale color wheel with 20 hues, and each one of those hues has its own string. And while you had the paint out, I had you mix out or put the colors on the pigment file. The pigment file only has the hue circuit, which is the each one of the hues at its maximum chroma, right? Just a little indication on the outside edge. So what we're going to do today then is learn how to use the pigment file. Now the pigment file in the short term is really more beneficial for people who've had some experience painting. The reason is you probably have a box or boxes of paints that you've used over the years that may or may not be on the list that I gave you. So the pigment file, what we're going to do is it's going to help you, what the pigment file will do is it will help you categorize where those various brands and various colors fall within the color space that you created with the color wheel, the value scale color wheel that we made in the last few videos. So we're going to be going through, and I just randomly picked a few colors out of my, paint boxes. So I'm going to show you how to use the pigment file to categorize the tubes of paint that you already have within the color space that we created. Now, again, that's a short-term benefit for people who've had experience painting and probably have, like I do, boxes of paints around. But that doesn't mean that people who are just starting to paint now that it's not going to benefit you as well. I mean, I gave you a very specific list of colors to use on the color wheel. Over the course of your painting career, you're going to be buying different tubes of paint, different colors. So it's important the pigment file helps you as well, because it's important when you buy those new brands of paint or those new pigments that were not on the list that I gave you. It's important that you understand where they fall within the color wheel that you've created. So, and you'll find, again, those of you who have had some experience painting know this. Those who are starting painting, right now you're going to see this, that you could take a particular color like cadmium orange, and you could go with 3 or 4 different brands and see that there are slight fluctuations in what that cadmium orange looks like from brands, between brands. Some of the cadmium oranges veer towards yellow a little bit. Some of the cadmium oranges veer towards red a little bit. So it's important that when you buy it, you get an understanding clearly of where the bias is or where that falls in color space. But then, of course, there are other pigments in the blues, the greens, the purples, other pigments, other tubes that are not on the list that I gave you, that are going to fall in different points on the color wheel. So again, it's important, the pigment file, the importance of the pigment file is it helps you understand where tubes of paint that are not on the list that I gave you, where they fall within the spectrum of hues. So that's the goal. That's what we're doing with the pigment file, is creating a filing system that helps you understand where your tubes of paint, where your tubes of paint fall within the color wheel. So with that said, let's switch off here. So materials needed. You need, of course, your value scale color wheel that you have already created. You need your pigment file, right? Have those available. We're going to be using those to reference as we go through pulling out colors. You need whatever palette you're using. And again, I mentioned before that I always recommend glass just because it's easier to clean. You can let the paint dry on there if you can't clean it immediately, and it's easy to scrape off. You need a palette knife and a paint knife. Palette knife, a Sharpie marker or some type of a marker or pen that you'll be using to mark on your pigment file, and paper towels. You don't need any medium with this because you're just going to be mixing as you see. I'm going to mix some paint in, mix up some paint, and just take the palette knife and apply it right to the pigment file and clean it off, so I don't need any complex solvents or mediums at this point. So I randomly grabbed a few tubes of paint. I'm going to need some white. I forgot. I'm going to need some white as well. I randomly grabbed, went through my files or my drawers, paint drawers, paint boxes, and just randomly picked out some colors. And I'm going to show you how to file them. So I have yellow ochre pale, burnt sienna, Venetian red, sap green, permanent mauve, and cerulean blue. Again, I randomly grabbed a few. I've got tons and tons of other boxes, but when I go through these and show you how to file them, what the logic is and how to file them, you'll be able to figure it out. You can go through your own paint box on your own time, get the colors that you have that are different than the ones that I gave you, and file them on the pigment file. So let's start first with yellow ochre pale. Actually, I'm going to move these off of here. So I'm going to take a little bit of white, put it out in the corner, and a little bit of yellow ochre. Now, the reason that we have the white available, we're not going to necessarily need it in every situation. The reason we have it available, though, is the problem that can come in with the pigment file is there are certain tubes of paint where the value or the chroma is, the value is dark or the chroma is weak. So it might be hard with that tube of paint to figure out where that color fits within color space because there's a big difference in chroma between what you have out and what's on the color wheel. So the purpose of the white is what you need to do to be able to take weaker chroma colors and relate them to stronger chroma colors is to basically you have to even out the chroma situation. And how you do that is by mixing up the tube of paint that you have, mixing up an 8 or 9 value of that pigment, which will minimize the chroma, and that will allow you to take that weaker chroma color and relate it to stronger chroma colors because you've basically evened out their chromas. Case in point, in fact, maybe that's a better one to start with. Burnt sienna. Burnt sienna is dark and dull. It's going to be hard for me to figure out exactly where this falls if I'm looking at a color wheel of basically fairly chromatic colors. So what I need to do is mix up, in this case, the burnt sienna, mix it up to an 8 or 9 value with white, and then take that and compare it to the tints on the color wheel to see where it falls within color space. I'll show you right now. So take a little bit of the white, a little touch of the burnt sienna, and as I said, 8 or 9 value, doesn't matter which. It's going to do the same thing, which is minimize that chroma. One second here, so let me move some of my materials. So I have my tint mixed up. I'm going to get it on my palette knife, right? Good and thick on my palette knife. I'm going to move, in this case I just have to move the color wheel, or I'm sorry, the palette. Sorry, I haven't had my coffee yet today. And I'm going to take my color wheel. So I now have an 8 or 9 value of burnt sienna. Now I'm going to look at the 8 and 9 value tints of each one of the color families on my color wheel And I'm going to look to see which one of the hues, that burnt sienna at the, in this case, 8 or 9 value, which one of the hues it most relates to. And what I find is, now again, I know this is going to be hard for you to see on the camera. I'm looking at my screen and I can see that the hues in here all look the same at the 9 value. But I guarantee if you have burnt sienna and you do what I just did and hold this up, you're going to see exactly what I'm seeing, which is, if it definitely, when I look at the 9 value tint of burnt sienna, it's definitely in this range on the color wheel. And I can see it's not yellow, yellow, red. It's not red, yellow, red. It's closest to yellow, red. It might even be yellow, red, which is our cat orange with white, if you remember. It might even be leaning towards red, yellow, red a little bit, but it's definitely in this part of the color wheel. So as I said, if I were to just look at the burnt sienna by itself, right, burnt sienna by itself, it might have been very difficult for me to come to a very accurate understanding of where that falls in color space. But by mixing it up to a 9, it minimizes that chroma, brings the value up, and also minimizes the chroma so that I can use it to check against my more chromatic colors by matching the value and thereby getting those chromas closer. So once I figure out where the hue is, in this case, burnt sienna fits just about at yellow-red, I can bring my pigment file over and take a little bit of that paint, put my 9 value tint. Remember when we created this, there are these spokes, these pencil spokes that are in here. So I can drop that on the pencil spoke, the 9 value. Now it's not enough to just place it there. That's good. I mean, I'm understanding where it falls, but really to get the real benefit of seeing the range of color available with burnt sienna, what I can opt to do is I've placed it now at the yellow red, but I can take a second and just mix in. I'm not worried about matching value. I'm just mixing an intermediate hue. Or I'm sorry, I'm mixing an intermediate value. So instead of just having the 9 value of the burnt sienna, I've now created an intermediate value between the two, between the pure burnt sienna and the 9, right? I've created an intermediate value. So I can, on the pigment file, now instead of just putting the 9 value tint, I can put my intermediate value. And get a paper towel. My pure pigment, the pure burnt sienna, and drop that in. So I have a good understanding just with these 3 values. Not only am I understanding where it files within the pigment file, but I'm also seeing what the actual color looks like in different values, right? So I have the pure burnt sienna, I have the middle value burnt sienna, and I have the burnt sienna at a 9. So I can get a full expression of what the tube of paint actually looks like in different values, and I have it filed, right? So as soon as I get done with that, I want to take my pen and mark it, right? Now usually what I will do is, not only am I going to mark that it's burnt sienna, but I'll give an indication of the brand, because as I mentioned, if those of you have painted before, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Between brands, and this is another one, I mentioned cadmium orange, the burnt sienna is another one. When you go from manufacturer to manufacturer, you will see a variety of differences between burnt siennas. So it's important when I put these things on the pigment file, I want to note the manufacturer as well as the tube, the name of the tube itself. So in this case, I've got Winsor Newton, WN, burnt sienna, right? Whatever notation system works for you is fine. So I've now figured out where Winsor Newton burnt sienna is within color space. So the benefit of this is in the future, if I need to reach for an orange, a yellow red, but maybe I don't need all of the chroma that the string of yellow red that I have here, right? The string that has cadmium orange and burnt umber. Maybe I need an orange or a yellow red that isn't as chromatic as this. Now I know instead of having to pull this out and spend a whole lot of time neutralizing it, I might be able to grab for my burnt sienna, add white to it, and get a weaker chroma yellow red. So again, the nice thing about creating the pigment file is not only do you have a clear understanding of where the tubes of paint fall in color space, but it also gives you an indication when you're painting if you need a weaker chroma version, in this case, of a particular hue, you know that you have some options available because you've taken some time to file the pigments that you already have according to where they fall in color space. I hope that makes sense. So I had my burnt sienna. I figured out what family where that filed, what hue family that fell within. I filed it. Now I'll go back to that initial yellow ochre. Now the yellow ochre is a little easier because it's already high enough in value and the chroma is up higher. So as I said, the addition of the white really is necessary when you have darker or weaker chroma colors that might be harder to figure out where they fall or harder to relate them to stronger chroma, higher value colors. So in this case, we already have a higher value, stronger chroma with the yellow ochre. So it should be easier for me in this case to just take some of this on my palette knife, put my palette up, get my color wheel out, and move it across the color wheel. And I can immediately see, this is going to be easier for you to see on camera as well, it relates, it's almost spot on to yellow or with yellow red. Not in between. As I said, some of these pigments, they might fall in between. Some of these tubes of paint might fall in between families. This is almost spot on yellow red. So I figured out what hue family the yellow ochre belongs to, the yellow ochre pale. Drop this on the pigment file. And because this is even though this is a lighter value, still want to mix up a tint. Just so I can see the range of value. Or at least get a sense of what this pigment, this tube color looks like in different values. Or at least one different value. You can mix two if you want. I tend to, when I have a tube that is higher in value in chroma, I'll only put one tint. You can certainly put two if you would like. As a matter of fact, you know what? Let's just do two. Let's just do it so that there's consistency. I mean, as with everything, you're going to figure out what works for you. It's not a right or wrong. It's just a preference. I at least want to get the pigment right out of the tube and at least one tint, but two does give me a better understanding of what the tube color looks like, at least in two different values. So I've got a middle value mixed up. Now the other thing, as I'm getting this put down, that doesn't hurt while you're doing this, is have your value scale available, not to mix these tints against, but more importantly, when you have that tube of paint, in this case the yellow ochre pale or the burnt sienna, take the opportunity while you're doing this to figure out what the home value of that tube of paint is. Right? If you remember the home value is the value at which the paint comes out of the tube. So we talked about cadmium orange. Cadmium orange home value right out of the tube is a 7. I'll just throw it out there. Winsor Newton burnt sienna, home value is a 2. Yellow ochre light, Winsor Newton, home value is a 6. So as I said, as you go through these and you're filing, take that opportunity to figure out the home value of the pigment that you're using. And a lot of times I'll even mark it on the tube itself. So we have Winsor Newton, mark it, yellow, ochre, pale. Move to the next one. Let's see, what else did I grab here? Let's try Sap Green. Okay, so Sap Green is another one, if you've worked with it before. I can see it's green, there's no question about it, but it's dark, it looks fairly chromatic, and if anyone has used it, it's a good glazing color. But again, where does that green, I mean, I've got an entire portion of the color wheel that's green. So where exactly, which part of which hue of green does Sap Green file best with? We want to get that mixed up with white because it's darker. I'm going to mix up a 9 to start with, and then I'll mix a middle value once I categorize it. Mix up the 9 value tint, and take some of that on my palette knife. And hunt for it. So in this case, and that's Winsor Newton Sap Green, looks like the best match. Now this is where we have a situation where, and this happens all the time, it's not a spot-on match with green-yellow, and it's not a spot-on match with green-green-yellow. It actually looks like it falls somewhere in between. So in the case of with the pigment file, what we're going to do on the pigment file then is let's get very exact. Let's not jam this into one family or the other if it doesn't look like either or. On the pigment file, we can get very specific. Instead of putting it at green, green, yellow, or green, yellow, we can put it in between. Right? So we've now really understand, because we have these 20 spaces, we can even place things in between to really understand where these tubes of paint are falling. It's not this, it's not this, it's actually somewhere in between. So I have my tint, 9 value tint, mix my in-between value, it doesn't have to be value specific, it's just getting something in between the home value and the 9. You can really see the color come out there as well. And put it down. And over time, as you buy paint, this file is going to become more and more crowded as you file new pigments, which is good. Gives you a clear understanding of where these tubes are fitting in color space, at least the color space that we created on our Munsell scale. Winsor Newton, Sap Green. Got 2 more just to walk you through. I'm sure this is all making sense at this point, but we'll do 2 more examples before we call it quits for the day. Get permanent mauve. Winsor Newton again. Just happen to grab a bunch of Winsor Newtons. This is a little easier to tell. I can see it's definitely in the purple to red purple range. But as usual, let's get that tint mixed up. Doesn't hurt. Eight or 9 value and check it. Certainly, I know it's down here somewhere. That looks like, and again, I know based on the camera, you can't, I'm sure you can't see a difference between these 9 values. That looks like that's a spot on purple, red, purple. So trust me on that. As I said, you'll have your own color wheel in front of you, so what you're not seeing here with your own pigments, you're going to be able to see. It's definitely not purple, definitely not red, purple, purple, red, purple. It doesn't even look like it's in between. It looks like it's a really good match for purple, red, purple. Put a little bit. Turn it this way. Purple, red, purple. And mix my in-between tint. And drop it down. Drop them down. And mark it. Winsor Newton Permanent Mauve. And as I said, I just happened to grab a bunch of Winsor Newton colors. For those of you who have painted for a while, I'm sure you've got your own box of different colors. The same, what we're doing here applies to whatever brand you have. You'll figure out where those tubes fall in color space. As I said, for those of you who haven't painted, it's going to be over your painting time, you will see, if you keep up with your pigment file and you start investigating other brands beyond the ones that I recommended, which is perfectly fine, you will see these slight shifts in hues between even colors that have the same name. Last one, Gamblin Cerulean Blue. And again, this is higher value, more chromatic. I think this one should be a little easier, should be a lot easier to tell where this falls. Get some of it on my paint knife. And pull out the color wheel, value scale color wheel. Actually, a little white in this might not hurt. It looks like it's falling between, that might be a spot on blue, purple, blue. That at least looks like what I'm seeing here. Let me mix a little white into that and see what the tint gives me. See if it confirms what I think I'm seeing here. Pardon me. Allergies are killing me. I have my 9. Yeah, this is definitely, in fact, I've mixed up more of an 8. Definitely closer to blue, purple, blue. Just a little weaker than the combination that I have. So, last one is my Gamblin Cerulean Blue. Drop my 9 value in. It's actually a little closer to an 8. Point is, it's very high value, but it's got enough pigment in there that I can actually see the color coming up. And mix up a tint. In between. And put it down. And as I said, now with this new knowledge, not only does it help me understand where my various tubes of paint are falling, just for categorization purposes. Let me mark this one before I forget. Gamblin, Cerulean blue. But in this case, it also helps long term. Let's just say I'm in a situation where I have something in front of me, still life, whatever, piece of fabric, doesn't matter. And I figured out that what's in front of me is falling in the blue, purple, blue hue range, but it's not as chromatic as that. If you remember, this is a combination of ultramarine blue and phthalo turquoise. Well, maybe I've got a blue, purple, blue in front of me that isn't quite that chromatic. Well, now, since I've done the work, I figured out that I have something available to me in my paint box that will give me that hue, but in a slightly weaker chroma fashion. So as I said, as you build your pigment file, it's going to help you when you're when you're painting, when there are times that you have things in front of you that are not as chromatic as the strings that are laid out here. Well, you have an option. Instead of putting out these chromatic strings and having to neutralize them, you may very well have something in your paint box already that is the hue that you need, but is actually closer to the chroma you need. So, pigment file. Take your time, file your pigments, make sure you keep up with it. Let's come back here. Make sure you keep up with it as you buy new pigments. Very important. And as I said, over time then, the more you get yourself in this habit of filing, then the more you buy when you're buying pigments, it really sharpens your eye. You start to really recognize, as soon as you see a pigment, where it falls in color space. And in the case of like we dealt with Sap Green, you'll even start to discern when things fall between hues. So all important for your color knowledge. Get to work on that pigment file. When you see me again, we have another big chunk of information, one more set of tools, which are the Chroma Charts. I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have any questions, as usual, leave them in the comment box. If you found this helpful, like and subscribe. Thank you very much. See you next time.